I didn't realise quite what revolutionary setting I'd be talking in. So I prepared a rather, shall we say, mainstream European talk that I was going to deliver. Shall we go for the rabble-rousing revolutionary version just for fun? So, let me start by putting this on the sort of macro-historical footing, right? Europe has seen at least a millennia of war, and really 2 or 3 millennia of war. It's been blood-soaked to the ankles in the best of times and the knee in average times. It's a terrible place to live in terms of conflict. So we come out of World War I, the first genuinely mechanised war, with a bone-deep horror of what humankind are capable of that takes probably 20 to 30 years to fully embed itself in the culture. It's artistic, it's political, you know, it's never again, the Great War, the war to end all wars, all the rest of this kind of language. Because what happened in Europe was so incredibly terrible. You know, mechanised warfare, you literally had people who had 20 or 30 years before been running around in brightly coloured red uniforms, you know, talking about how splendid the empire was, in the middle of trench warfare with machine guns. And the level of the shock is then doubled up again when we enter World War II. The unthinkable happens another time. Now the horrific new weaponry is rockets and eventually the nuclear bomb, which is, by the way, largely engineered by European refugees who take root in America. More or less the entire bomb team escaped the Holocaust. And you put yourself into this kind of position, and de Gaulle comes out of this mess and says, look, right, it is one Europe from the Urals to the sea that will decide the destiny of the world. And the ambition of this statement, given what's gone on before it, is almost unthinkable. To be able to say that Europe is going to, first of all, become united, that it's going to become peaceful, and that it's going to become a global force for good rather than ill, is unthinkable ambition. And this is what becomes the European political ethos. It's led by the elites, it's in response to unthinkable horror, it's on top of centuries of continuous bloodshed, and the European ideal is as ambitious as anything that Gandhi ever promoted, albeit veiled in a much more elitist political term. The concept of from the Urals to the sea as a united political bloc that will build on top of its capability to produce a better world for everybody is at the heart of this vision. Now, a lot of my involvement in the European process only goes back a couple of years. I got drafted by a project called Edge Riders, which was a Council of Europe, or is a Council of Europe research project, basically on the precariat, right? You're 25 years old, you're not going into education, you're not going into work, and you don't become unemployed and wasted. You find something else to do, you find a new perspective. And that brought me into contact with an enormously wide range of European youth from all kinds of different walks of life. And what I learned from these kids is that they have no understanding that Europe is not a country. Right? For them, it's always had a single currency. They've always been able to travel freely without any kind of passport or hindrance of borders. They've always been able to work anywhere they like. They've always been able to own property anywhere they like. They've always been able to treat the entire continent as if it was home. So the idea that the crisis is going to in some way unpick this single European identity, if anybody tries that, they're going to wind up in a direct conflict with the European generation. The kids who've grown up with a unified Europe for all intents and purposes, the people who have no understanding that Europe is not naturally this way, will fight tooth and nail to be able to continue to live in Berlin, to be able to travel in France, to be able to work in Italy. For them, this is just what Europe is. And the idea that the elites have gone from being pro-European integration to anti-European integration, now that they're being asked to pay for what it is they said they wanted, and that the European political base is now among the young rather than among the old, is a radical transformation. I think if you'd shown that future to de Gaulle, he would secretly have been extremely amused that it had become the people's vision of Europe that was now politically dominant rather than the political vision of the elite. The problem that we have is that the political elites are nation-state level political elites that are fighting like hell for their particular patch of turf and their role within it, rather than accepting the collapse of the nation-state political elite in favour of a European political elite. We're at the point now where what was initially advantageous to the nation-state political elites was more integration, and now we're over the hump where further integration is now disadvantageous to the political elites inside each country as power migrates to the European level. Right? Supersidiarity, where more and more power is creeping up into the European platform, is causing the nation-state elites to dig in their heels because they're about to lose their mandates. If we wind up with not just a financial union, right, not just a single currency, but a single policy with European bonds, with European spending, very, very, very quickly we're going to discover that the vast majority of what the nation-state governments are for is making social policy. This is how much money you have in the bucket. You decide how to spend it depending on your country's own priorities. Rather than the notion of the nation-state as being the ultimate arbiter of power, it will become the European superstate. And whether or not we make it all the way over that hump into that European superstate condition is an open question. But I think it's very important to understand that the nature of the financial crisis, the nature of the crisis of authority that is within that, is about de Gaulle's vision, Churchill's vision to a degree, rapidly having become the lived experience of the young, while the old continues to think in nation-state terms. In actual fact, what we're seeing is another generational fault line. It's not just that the old have property and the young can't afford rent, it's also that the old operate inside of the nation-state and the young operate in Europe. And until we really begin to understand how deep that generational rift goes, we're in acute danger of making war on the young using the resources of the old, and then having the young beat the entire situation back into a pulp in 10 years when they finally have real power. It's a razor's edge whether we retain a collaborative relationship between old and young, or whether the split between the nation-state and the European vision turns into a split between generations of a kind that will not easily heal. So if we are to move forward into this kind of European superstate, and I'm not saying that I'm for or against that, I simply think that it's become de facto political reality for anybody under about 30, so we have to accept that this is what we've done. Then we should ask, what does that really look like? And obviously the direct point of comparison here is America, which, as we know, is about the worst governed country in the world. Right? The levels of 14th century religious insanity coupled with political corruption of the kind that would have made the Vatican band look like Butlins, are profound issues. Right? The fact that they're spending something like 25% of their national budget on arms in an environment where nobody other than them has started a war in about a generation, right? They've gone nuts. So the idea that we might build a sort of federal European superstate and then have it turn into be another 500 million person banana republic, I think should be an acute threat. Right? We act as if federalism is the answer. No, federalism is the question. Once you assemble a political bloc that large, it can develop pathologies on a scale which are unimaginable outside of a bloc that size. Right? If you run Ireland as badly as you run America, you can't imagine the situation you'd have. Much as we think that Ireland is frequently misruled, it's nothing compared to what's possible when you've got a much larger political bloc. Right? The degree to which the arms industry dictates American foreign policy, for example, is something that in a smaller country would be a highly visible national scandal. But in America it passes because the arms industry is clustered around Washington, D.C., so the vast majority of people in government are surrounded socially by arms dealers. They're surrounded by the folks who work for Lockheed Martin. It's their friends, it's their relatives. So you have a sort of defense industrial complex unit on the East Coast in the central government, and the rest of the country wrings its hands, but it's not like you ever hear from these people. Right? The enormous geographical size of the problem enables certain kinds of corruption to be buried in a way that you just never see day to day. So how do we avoid a catastrophic collapse in our quality of governance once we achieve this kind of federal solution? I think needs to be the acute question. It's not just a question of federalism, it's whose federalism and on what basis, and how is the corruption to be controlled? Because we all know that Europe is capable of astonishing levels of corruption. Right? You only need to look at the history of the Catholic Church when it had political power in Europe to understand the true nature of the problem. Right? Borgia popes, Pope Joe, 3 popes, all of this kind of stuff ran as a circus in an institution that was theoretically the source of political accountability and the source of political authority, the source of political legitimacy for 1,000 years. Right? To see the European Union step into the empty shoes of the Catholic Church as the centre of political as the centre of political legitimacy in Europe, and then immediately return to that level of corruption, is a completely imaginable future. Right? Given real power and lacking real oversight, just how much damage could a federal level do if it's constructed on even slightly the wrong foundation? And I don't think anybody in this room would defend the current European structure as something that has anything like the necessary levels of representation, transparency, and accountability necessary to avoid the kind of crippling corruption which has become a fact of life. It's incredibly important that we really take this on the nose, because it's all very well pushing for a Europe, but if it's a Europe that immediately falls down the black hole of corruption, what are we going to do? And I say the word corruption, very, very specifically. If you look at what's actually resulted in the bankrupting of Greece, Italy, and Spain, and Ireland, it goes directly into a collusion between the financial interests and the state to make the people pay for private debt. I used to live in Iceland. And in Iceland they simply let the banks go bankrupt. We didn't profit from you on the way up, and we're certainly not paying for you on the way down. Goodbye. Right? And it was a crisis, and they're back to growth. That is not the route that we've taken in Europe, largely as a way of protecting vested interests. The European consensus is that private interests are going to wind up being bailed out for as long as is necessary to preserve the status quo and the class structure as it stands. And if European integration is being driven by a desire to protect the status quo at the expense of the welfare of the common people, it's only going to get worse. Right? The time for straightening out Europe is now, because by the time that this integration is done, if it wasn't straightened now, it's not going to be straightenable then. In America, they almost certainly cannot dig themselves out of this hole without something approximating a revolution. Right? It's very hard to see how a single America can survive with a split that goes this thin and with the corruption on the level that they have. So if that's how bad it is in the States, that they're at the point of having to tear down their union to rebuild something with a straight line in it, let us not make the mistake of taking a crooked foundation forward into European unity. Because it can get really bad here. Right? What we know from the 20th century is just how bad it can get. Finally, I want to frame this in a global context. Much as we think that we are the poor, we are the rich. Right? There are 7 billion people in this world. The top 10% of, let's say, 700 million is largely composed of the middle classes in America, in Europe, and the upper classes in countries like India and China. That's pretty much what your 700 million looks like. We are the rich. So if we're going to talk about justice on climate and on poverty and on everything else, we are the ones that will pay. Right? We're going to have to open our wallets and take a third or a half of the money out and put it into a bucket marked, "We got rich on your backs and now we've screwed the world." Everybody has a fantasy, and this is particularly prevalent in the Greens and especially in the left, but particularly groups like Occupy. Everybody has a fantasy that when justice is done, we will be richer. It is not true. When justice is done, we will be poorer. The rich will be much poorer, we will be a bit poorer, and if you think about paying fair trade prices, not just for your coffee or tea, but for your laptops and your televisions and your cars, you could begin to see what that looks like. Right? A fair trade laptop could easily cost you 4,000 or 5,000 euros if it wasn't being produced by Chinese workers who have no right to unionize because their country is theoretically run by the union, using raw materials which are extracted at gunpoint in Africa by labourers that will starve if they miss 3 days of work in a row. Right? We have a seamless integration between capitalism, communism, and feudalism in this world, and it's the trade equilibrium which makes us rich. Imperialism spans all politics. And if we're to break the back of that in the continent where it started, we're going to have to start working for a living again. 20 to 30% of the population, by natural right, are probably going to wind up farming.
because we're not going to import everything we need. Manufacturing will come back, because if it costs you a fair trade price to buy it from China, you might as well make it in Germany. But it's not until we start thinking at thinking at a global scale about social justice that it's possible to imagine a future in which there are no deep lies at the heart of our society that first of all obscure the damage we've done to other people, and then eventually obscure the damage that other people are doing to us. Transparency will show that we are still guilty of imperialism, and the price that we're paying in the banking crisis is simply that being visited back upon us. This is how far we have to go from